Less than 2 weeks, people in King County won't need to prove they're vaccinated to enter many businesses or events. Within the last 2 hours, city and county leaders announced that they are removing the rule come March 1st, pointing to a decrease in cases. King 5's Glenn Farley joins us live. So, Glenn, while this is a county decision, can businesses still have their own requirements?
Well, they can. So I want to go right to a graphic that kind of hits some of the major points here right off the back. So this vaccine proof requirement, meaning showing your card or the equivalent to a person checking you in a restaurant, etc., will go away on March 1st. Businesses may decide, they want that extra protection for their employees. They can still require a vaccine proof before allowing you to sit down. And this is being done because 80% of the cases have basically been reduced in that period of time. Remember, this all came up during the whole Delta wave. Then the Omicron wave hit and it was continued. They knew this was going to be temporary when they first put this into place, announcing it back in September of last year and then putting it into effect on October 25th. But with nearly 90% of the people in King County above 12 years of age vaccinated now, I asked King County Executive Dow Constantine if it wasn't just practicality in taking this requirement off.
We cannot wait until the very last person has been vaccinated. And so our public health leaders and we have determined that this is perhaps the best point at which to relax this particular requirement.
Now, as far as King County itself goes, Dow Constantine announced that people here working in places like the Chinook building, other county facilities, will start coming back to work themselves on March 1st as well. The city is also putting similar things into place. Bruce Harrell, our new mayor of Seattle, was also at this event. But masking is not coming off yet, and you'll hear more about that coming up from the county's chief health officer tonight on King 5 News at 4 o'clock. Live in Seattle, Glenn Farley, King 5 News.
Jessica, it's important to point out, and the county said so itself, is that even though they are removing this requirement on the county level, businesses can still choose whether or not they want to require proof of vaccination. Talking with businesses here in the Belltown neighborhood, many of them are happy about this news, but they did say there is going to be a discussion with neighbors, with their staff about what the next move will be.
There you go. Do you need anything else with that?
It's been a tough 2 years for restaurants, including Belltown Pizza.
Chili flakes, Parmesan right there.
They've been navigating a lot of changes. Owner Brian Lee says today's news of the county lifting its vaccine requirements spread fast.
That's the conversation piece today is, oh, did you hear about the mandate?
Officially starting March 1st, King County will no longer require businesses to check vaccination status. However, businesses may still choose to. In fact, last August, many Belltown bars and restaurants issued their own vaccine requirement 2 months before the county's order went into effect.
We did it to make people feel comfortable.
Brian said he won't necessarily remove the requirement just because the county gave the okay.
I'm going to discuss it with my staff, and we're going to find out as a whole. I don't want to make decisions for how comfortable my staff feels at work.
He also plans to talk with other businesses, like Ohana, located just down the street.
I was excited about it, actually. I think it's time. I think the majority of people are vaccinated, so I think it's good.
Ohana manager Marco Vergara agrees. What happens next will be a neighborhood decision.
I think we're going to do the similar thing as Brian, kind of like do a quick survey, but I'm leaning more towards doing away with it at this point.
Because I think we're stronger as a community than just an isolated business doing what they want.
Both spots grateful for this step forward after a tough 2 years.
This is getting easier, or either we're just getting better at it. I don't know which is which.
So when the county made its announcement earlier today, one thing they mentioned is that right now this is the best point to relax that proof of vaccine requirement. And Brian mentioned that it's also a good time, at least for this neighborhood, because as we head into the spring, they expect more out-of-state tourists who often don't carry proof of vaccination. Live in Seattle tonight, Callie Greenberg, King 5 News.
Micron. Micron. A unit of length, the thousandth part of 1 millimeter, the millionth part of a meter. Micron synonyms: micrometer, micrometer. M-I-C-R-O-N. Micron. The name for the 15th letter of classical
Micron.
modern Greek, the 16th in ancient and old
A
Greek.
unit
Of length, the thousandth part of 1 millimeter, the millionth part of a meter. Micron synonyms: micrometer, micrometer. M-I-C-R-O-N. Micron. Micron. A unit of length, the thousandth part of 1 millimeter, the millionth part of a meter. Micron synonyms: micrometer, micrometer. M-I-C-R-O-N. Micron.
The confluence of sinuses, torcular hierophily, or torcula is the connecting point of the superior sagittal sinus, straight sinus, and occipital sinus. It is found deep to the occipital protuberance of the skull. Blood arriving at this point then proceeds to drain into the left and right transverse sinuses. The superior sagittal sinus often drains into either exclusively or predominantly one transverse sinus, and the straight sinus drains into the other. An older term often used for the confluence of sinuses, torcular hierophily, describes the veins as a gutter, or canal, and honors Herophilos, the Greek anatomist who was the first to use cadavers for the systematic study of anatomy. This term more precisely refers to the concavity in the bone, which is the location of the confluence of sinuses. Torcular. Torcular. Torcular.
we're going to talk about the drainage of venous blood from the brain. This follows on from our discussion of the arterial supply, which can be found in a different video. The venous drainage from the brain occurs via two types of vessels. There's the sinuses and the veins. Sinuses are the spaces between the meningeal dural membranes and the periosteum that lines the inner surface of the bones of the skull. Sinuses are not true blood vessels, and they sit outside of the dura. Veins are true blood vessels, and they can be separated into two subsystems. The superficial cerebral veins run across the surface of the brain and lie under the dura in the subarachnoid space, in close proximity to brain tissue, and they drain the cerebrum. Deep veins, as the name suggests, drain the deep subcortical regions and the white matter surrounding the ventricles. The principal sinus is the superior sagittal sinus, which sits superficially in the falx cerebri. The superficial cerebral veins drain into the superior sagittal sinus via the venous lacunae, which are found alongside, while CSF drains into it via the arachnoid granulations. The superior sagittal sinus follows the longitudinal fissure down the posterior surface of the brain, ending at the confluence of the sinuses. From here, the transverse sinuses emerge. Now, we should note at this point that the connections between the right and left transverse sinuses is highly variable. Blood flow from the superior sagittal sinus tends to favour the right side, and in extreme cases, the right transverse sinus is simply a continuation of the superior sagittal sinus. The transverse sinus follows the groove formed by the tentorium cerebelli until it turns downwards around the cerebellum, where it is termed the sigmoid sinus. The superficial cerebral vein follows the course of the lateral fissure, or sulcus, taking tributaries from across the lateral parts of the cerebrum. It passes round the temporal lobe and ultimately drains into the cavernous sinus, which is connected to the sigmoid sinus by the superior petrosal sinus. The cavernous sinus is drained by the inferior petrosal sinus, which ultimately joins the sigmoid sinus, draining into the internal jugular vein. This completes the superficial venous drainage system. But there's also the deep venous system. The deep venous drainage system also comprises sinuses and veins. The inferior sagittal sinus sits at the base of the longitudinal fissure, along on the superior surface of the corpus callosum, running parallel with the superior sagittal sinus above. The internal cerebral veins run atop the third ventricle, joining below the splenium to form the great cerebral vein. This is also known as the great vein of Galen. The great cerebral vein and inferior sagittal sinus join to form the straight sinus, which in turn feeds the left transverse sinus at the confluence of the sinuses. Now, as before, we should note that, as with the right transverse sinus, there is great variability in the degree to which the straight sinus continues directly into the transverse sinus. A small connecting sinus is shown here, but it may be large, it may be small, it may be not there at all. The left transverse sinus follows a similar path to the right side, along the groove of the tentorium cerebelli to become the sigmoid sinus, and thus the left internal jugular vein. Now, we should also note for clarity that the cavernous sinus, petrosal sinus, and the superficial veins for the left side of the brain are not shown here, but they follow similar paths to those seen on the right side. Now, much of the medial and inferior surfaces of the cortex drain into the anterior cerebral vein, which closely follows the path of the anterior cerebral artery. It joins with the deep middle cerebral vein, which closely follows the middle cerebral artery, to form the basal vein. The basal veins drain into the internal cerebral veins and from there to the straight sinus via the great cerebral vein and therefore onto the jugular.
Auricular. Auricular. Auricular.
Omicron. The name for the 15th letter of Classical and Modern Greek, the 16th in Ancient and Old Greek. O-M-I-C-R-O-N.
Auricular.
Omicron.
Auricular. Auricular.
Omicron.
Auricular.
O-M-I-C-R-O-N.
Auricular.
Omicron. O-M-I-C-R-O-N. Omicron.
Omicron is the 15th letter of the Greek alphabet. In the system of Greek numerals it has a value of 70. It is rarely used in mathematics because it is indistinguishable from the Latin letters O and easily confused with the digit 0. This letter is derived from the Phoenician letter Ayin. In classical Greek, Omicron represented the sound O, in contrast to omega, ee, and ii, a. In modern Greek, Omicron represents the sound e. Letters that arose from Omicron include Roman O and Cyrillic O. In Unicode the capital letter is code point U plus 039F and the lowercase is U plus 03BF. The uppercase letter of Omicron was originally used in mathematics as a symbol for big O notation, representing the asymptotic rate of growth of a function. In popular culture, Omicron is frequently used to designate the 15th star in a constellation group, using a combination of magnitude and position. Stars with the Omicron designation include Omicron Andromedae, Omicron Ceti, and Omicron Pisces. The last of these is well known due to its use as a setting in science fiction, including Star Trek, Mystery Science Theater 3000, Transformers, and Futurama. Character encodings, Greek Omicron/Coptic O. Mathematical Omicron, these characters are used only as mathematical symbols. Stylized Greek text should be encoded using the normal Greek letters, with markup and formatting to indicate text style. References.
Omicron. The name for the 15th letter of Classical and Modern Greek, the 16th in Ancient and Old Greek. O-M-I-C-R-O-N. Omicron. Omicron. O-M-I-C-R-O-N.
Door killer. Door killer.
Omicron.
Door killer.